access skills in the same way. However, I came up with this radical idea that movement was a thought. And if I could find a way to have the right way of thinking about the movement, I would be able to replicate it. So I started researching as much as I could in the early days of videotape, and watching any type of movement that I could, any type of sports, any type of dance, any type of physical expression. And so I tried to replicate it. I'm not a visual learner, but one thing we learned from neuroscience in the past 10 years is that when you watch something, the same thing is represented in your brain through things called mirror neurons. So watching a demonstration, even if you're not a visual learner, can help ignite the brain so that it can find a way to figure out how to duplicate the movement. So that was a pretty radical idea for 30 years ago. 40 years ago. It's getting longer. The problem was when I went to duplicate those movements, there were small gaps that I couldn't access. It was a clunk, a jerk in the movement, or a quick acceleration to substitute for lack of motor control. So I found early on the difference between movement and mobility. My brain knew this was the end goal, the end range, but it didn't know how to get there. So I had to make the movement smaller and smaller and smaller until I could find where I was missing mobility. And then try and go in there, pull out that component, make it smooth, and then plug it back in. If the movement is small enough, it's errorless. And even somebody with my physical and learning challenges could then duplicate one of these large, graceful movements. This early learning center that's here in Washington attempts to do this from many different angles. If you make the challenge small enough, it's impossible to make mistakes, because you can shine off the edges of the movement and plug it back in. It's smooth enough to integrate with everything else. Movement is just one more level. If you watch a movement, it's impossible for you not to duplicate it in your brain. I'll give you an example. Don't think of a pink elephant. Your brain can't not do something, which is fortunate for me. So, when we go through some of the drills, I want you to remember that the real purpose that we're here is to try and find a smoother way to learn. Not to accomplish anything, not to achieve anything. The brain's already fantastic at that. It's innately programmed to do that. But there are alternatives that we can help others realize that will give them access to what we normally take for granted. And quality of movement is the biggest one. There's not very many things in our lives, aside from maybe sight or touch, that we take for granted as much as pain-free movement, quality of movement. That's what I mean. When it's gone, boy, do we miss it. And when you have early motor challenges, it can skew your whole perspective of the world. Even when later in life you're in severe pain, everything's great. It's bad enough that we don't get sun very often. When we're in pain, it's really hard. So, if we can help find a way to get our groups together to try and promote not just financial support, but the emotional support to realize that we can find a way to get this problem small enough that we can fix it, that we can access it, and then a lifetime of suffering could be abated. I mean, think about the impact you can have on just one kid, and now you have an entire center that is advocating for their growth. One person can have a huge impact. An entire school, a new generation, they could change everything just from the support that you're getting today. So, from me, thank you so much for what you're doing, for showing up here. I really appreciate it. Now, movement versus mobility. So, the brain's not wired to thrive. Our body is sees a movement, it does everything possible to successfully duplicate it, irrespective of our health. Only this part of our brain, our front brain, is the safety gauge, which says, hold on, that's not probably a good idea. Why don't we slow down and find a way to do this a little more efficiently? So the movement's immediately duplicated, but it wires around any lapse or gap in movement. So if I were to move into something large, and then I see that, and I try and duplicate it, my body might try and move there quickly to the end range of where it's all the fingertips go, rather than seeing the small bricks that are laid on top of it in order to make sure that it's safe. So all of our building blocks have to be conscious instead of unconscious. Consciously, we can find immobility and freedom. Unconsciously, we move around those immobilities and we're subject to them, we're enslaved by it. So, movement versus mobility, we're going to start with the smallest possible building blocks and then see how far we can go with it. I haven't left one person behind, ever. Meaning that if we do this small enough, if we work on just the smallest component possible, you're going to be surprised at your capacity at the end. Because your brain's already there. As soon as it sees movement, it can already achieve the end range. Our goal then is to find all the small components in between that allow us to achieve that. It was the early childhood challenges that I had that gave me that capacity to see that. So when our initial impulse might be to feel sad or even pity for a child facing a particular learning challenge. It's going to be their biggest blessing. The goal is to remove the suffering and shame associated with it, so they figure out what their talent is. So, let's do that together. Let's start with our neck. I'm going to give you two options on every exercise. I'm going to give you an open exercise and a closed exercise. The open exercise is relatively unpredictable, and the closed exercise is pretty much predictable, but you have to go a lot slower because it's really easy to find where you're not mobile. So if you go too fast, your body can tighten to protect itself. When you encounter a range that's uncomfortable, I want you to exhale and back off. I want you to shave around tension rather than going into it. And I want you to make this interactive. So if you have a question about a movement, this is a workshop, it's not a class. We're going to go through and we're going to find out. That doesn't exactly feel right. I'm feeling this here. Okay. Now, if you're feeling that there, how do we rewire that so that it's no longer immobile and resisting? That's really the thing that we have to group think on this. So, let's start with an